The very last thing we pretty much talked about was education reform. So let's go ahead and click here and let's get education reform. 1800 Massachusetts, the only state requiring free public schools, I think is where we left off. Middle class reformers called for tax supported education. By 1860, every state had offered free public education to whites, and the U.S. had one of the highest literacy rates. Now go ahead and pause it, get this down. Going to talk a little bit about Horace Mann. All right, now education reform. Once again, I want you to circle that word reform at the very top of your notes. Reform. Remember, what does it mean to reform something? To change it, to make it better. Now, Horace Mann in Massachusetts is going to want to reform the education system, the public education system. Very important you understand this, public education. He'll become known as the father of American education, and is under his ideas that we created a state board of education, underlying that, and adopted a minimum length school year. That means we go for a certain number of days. He wants to provide training for teachers, and also we can thank him for me because it's his idea to include subjects like history. So this one's a pretty easy one to remember because in Amarillo we of course have a middle school, Horace Mann Middle School. But public education creates independence, and of course independence creates freedom. And freedom's going to lead to the Civil War. Now, pause this, get it down. The Asylum Movement, another part of your Great Awakening reform movement. Now, the Asylum Movement, you need to make sure you highlight her name. Her name is Dorothy Dix. Now, with Dorothy Dix, she is a Boston school teacher. I find that interesting because, of course, education is going to create more reforms. School teacher takes the lead in advancing and in advocating state-supported asylums for the mentally ill. Now, you guys need to make sure you understand this, maybe out beside this slide, right? That the mentally ill had been treated like prisoners, like lepers. They were chained, they were beaten, they were thrown in prisons, and basically we all know what happens in prisons to people who cannot defend themselves. They are raped, they are tortured. And what she does is she attracts attention to this movement by reporting the horrors of the mental ill treatments. She tells them being kept in cages and closets and beaten. And in response to Dorothy Dix's efforts of this reform movement, and I want to make sure you highlight this, 28 states are going to maintain mental institutions by 1860. And nowadays, if you think about this change, we're moving from how we treated them then to now we treat as in medically treat mentally ill patients now. No longer do you just throw them in a prison and get them out of society and isolate them. Now we are going to isolate them when needed, when they're dangerous, but you have treatment options, and I want to make sure we get this word down, you're writing it down. Rehabilitation is going to be the goal of the asylums, caring for them, not just isolating them and forgetting about them in a closet, but reforming the personal character, reforming how they act, reforming how they can interact with other people. So this is where that change kind of happens, and it's part of the Second Great Awakening. Pretty important aspect. And what you have here, just this is a little bit politically incorrect, but in 1849, you have one of the very first ideas for what we are going to see called as a lunatic asylum. Obviously, we don't use that word anymore, but this is basically an insane asylum. And there are these still in this day and age. If you go on the way from here to Dallas, there is a mentally ill kind of hospital, if you will, that cares for people, that like the one woman down in Corpus Christi that drove her car into the ocean with her children in it, mentally insane. That's where she's kept. So that's what we're looking at. Now, let's go to probably what is the biggest part of the Second Great Awakening that leads to the Civil War, abolitionism. Pause it, get it down. All right, now you wrote down William Lloyd Garrison, and you're writing down he is the publisher of what we call the Liberator. I want to make sure out beside the Liberator, and this might be a quiz question tomorrow, you write down this is a newspaper. But it is a newspaper if it's the abolitionist newspaper, is it in the North or the South? It is a northern newspaper. First appears in 1831, and it sends shockwaves across the country. Now, with this, William Lloyd Garrison, I want you to make sure you also look at this. William Lloyd Garrison is not an African American. He's white. So this first appeared, massively shocks the country. He repudiated gradual emancipation. Okay, I want you to circle that. Okay, that means he does not want gradual emancipation or freedom. He wants slaves freed, and he wants them freed now. He advocated racial equality and argued that slaveholders should not be compensated for freeing slaves. So it's something to take a look at. Okay, here is a copy of the Liberator, if you will. This is going to be the headline of the Liberator. You notice it says William Lloyd Garrison at the top. I want you to also circle down in the left-hand corner, what city was this published in? Boston, Massachusetts, the same place in which we see the temperance movement taking off. And Boston is going to be the heart place of a lot of these reform movements. Premier issue, January 1st, 1831. Now, pause this, get it down. Another abolitionist. Now, this abolitionist, I bet money you already know his name. Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass is freeing wants to free blacks. He's an abolitionist. He escaped slavery in Maryland. To abolitionists, slavery was a moral question, not an economic question. I'm going to be honest with you. You should know who Frederick Douglass is. He writes a book called The Narrative of Frederick Douglass in this, and he's going to publish something called The North Star. I'll tell you one of my favorite stories in all of American history is that this slave taught himself, now here's where he's ironic, and this might be a good quiz question, you might want to write this down, taught himself how to read and write so he could pass as a free man. And he will escape to the North, and he will become the leading movement leader of the abolitionist movement, and he will be invited to the White House and dine with Abraham Lincoln. That is what we call an important person that can transcend time and should go down in history. So pretty cool story there. Now, another person you need to look at when we look at abolitionists is a woman named Sojourner Truth. Pause this, get it down. Now, Sojourner Truth is going to also be known as Isabella Baumfree. She will write the narrative of Sojourner Truth. She's a slave who lived in Florence, Massachusetts, nationally known advocate for equality and justice. But basically, she's a Frederick Douglass, but she is a woman, which is probably the distinguishing factor. Now, pause it, get it down, although I'm going to be honest with you, you probably already know it, but still a good story. Moses, or Harriet Tubman, because she led her people to freedom. That's why she's called Moses. Maybe a good quiz question. Helped over 300 slaves to freedom via the Underground Railroad. I love the story of Harriet Tubman. She had a $40,000 bounty on her head. Don't tell me women aren't valuable. And then, of course, the little known thing is that she was a Union spy during the Civil War. But she was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and I love the fact they called her Moses. Is that not absolutely the perfect example of the Second Great Awakening? Religious movement, Moses, leading her people to freedom. Now let's talk a little bit about women during the antebellum era. I need you to pause this and get it down. This is a little bit of a bigger slide, and then I need you to listen and be ready. All right, now women in the early 1800s. Now, women in colonial times couldn't own land, couldn't really have any say-so whatsoever. If they were married, the only way you could have say-so is if you maybe grew up in the South a little bit, or if you were a widow. Basically, if you were married, your husband was in charge. If you weren't married, your dad was still in charge. Women in the early 1800s were unable to vote. We know that they were going to want suffrage, so that's coming. They have the legal status of a minor. They're single. They could own property, but if they're married, they have no control over anything, including their children. They cannot initiate divorce, and they couldn't make wills. Basically, down at the bottom here, sign a contract. They have no legal rights. That's how you paraphrase that. Now, one thing that I really want you to look at this. Anything changed in the 1800s from the 1700s, from the 1600s. Nothing has changed. Write that down. From the colonial time period. But this is where we start to see them wanting rights. So the separate spheres concept, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in class, but I want you to pause this and get it down. Now, the idea is that the woman is the Republican mother. Her job is to, and out beside Republican motherhood, I want you to say foster good citizens. Now, this idea is that she will help her children. She will create this citizenship in her children. She will maintain the household. But what has started to happen is that has started to kind of evolve into what we will call a cult of domesticity. Now, a cult, that word in of itself, it means that you're stuck in it, right? And what does domestic mean? Circle that. That means of the home. They're stuck in the home. A lot of the times during this time period, women are going to see the sphere as their home. Their role was to civilize their husband or educate their husband and family into good citizens. But I'm telling you right now, they were not treated very well. The power of a woman, this is a Massachusetts minister, is her dependence. Okay? Literally, a woman who gives up that dependence on a man to become a reformer yields the power of God that God has given her, and that her character is now unnatural. So bad if she wants independence. But there will be some women who want independence. Pause this, get it down. Here in the Second Great Awakening, we will see many women who want independence. The Grimke sisters, two Southern abolitionists who also are fighting for women's rights. They're a 2-for-1 deal. That's what I call them. Also a woman named Lucy Stone, who's going to be known as an cult of domesticity fighter or a women's rights advocate. One thing I will tell you, pause this, get it down. Women's rights movement is when the abolitionists actually start to divide over this issue. A lot of abolitionists want women's rights, and a lot of them think abolitionists in of itself is its own fight. We can't take on two. We don't want to ask for too much. So women find it easy to fight for abolitionism, but abolitionists sometimes won't fight for women's rights. So in 1848, the feminist reform movement is going to meet in a place called Seneca Falls, New York, for a Seneca Falls convention. And this is going to launch what we will call the modern women's movement. Make sure you circle that. This is where you start to hear the name Susan B. Anthony, okay? This is when we start to look at it. It's going to establish the arguments for the women's rights movement for the remainder of the century. I love this cartoon. What it would be like if ladies had their own way. Women are going off to just do whatever they want, and what are the men doing? Caring for the baby, doing the laundry. This is an exaggeration, but would this get your attention if you were a man? Yeah, you'd be like, my woman doesn't need to have that. I'll be doing the laundry. Now, women's rights in particular, when you flip over towards the very end of this, okay, I know I don't have this slide on the notes, but maybe we can add it in at the very top. There are two women in particular that you need to make sure you remember, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And out beside them, you need to put leaders of the Seneca Falls Convention. Leaders of the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, when you talk about Seneca Falls, you're talking about Lucretia, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, even a little Susan B. Anthony as well. They are going to draft what we are going to call the Declaration of Sentiments. And we are going to read this in class, okay? The Declaration of Sentiments is going to go down in history as basically the Women's Rights Declaration of Independence. Now, this slide you've got, pause it, get it down. The first women's rights movement in Seneca Falls, New York, 1849, that's a turn point year, again, leading up to the Civil War, is going to discuss these things. Educational and professional opportunities. Remember, if women can make money, can they make it on their own? There you go, women's rights. Property rights, legal equality, like marriage, divorce, child, say-so, etc. The repeal of any laws awarding father the custody of a child in divorce just because he's the father. But the one down at the bottom is the one I need you to star, circle, highlight, like ingrain in your mind, and that is suffrage rights. Now, a really good quiz question is if I were to ask you, what is suffrage? And if you listened right now, you'll know it is the right to vote. So this women's movement is about a lot of different things, but suffrage is what they have their eyes on. Are we clear? But it's a lot of different ones as well. Now, the 1830s to the 1900s, again, you have Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. Women's rights reformers want citizenship, the right to vote, and an education. They will support the abolitionism of slavery. Are we clear? However, when the Civil War happens, it's about slavery, not women's rights. So women's rights kind of takes a back seat, and you'll see that kind of take a little bit longer. But still, that's your antebellum reform era. A lot of good things coming out of it.